A lavish dinner meant to celebrate power and success turns into a silent collapse when a billionaire locks eyes with the last person he expected to see. His pregnant ex-wife stands across the room, calm and radiant, beside a CEO whose presence commands instant respect. And in that single moment, everything Richard believed he controlled begins to unravel. What follows is not shouting or scandal, but a quiet reckoning about pride, loss, and the price of choices that money can never undo. And I promise you, the weight of this ending only reveals itself when we walk through it together. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The Manhattan Steakhouse glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, each one casting sharp reflections across polished marble floors and linen-draped tables. This was not a place for casual meals or quiet conversations. It was a room designed for power, where deals were sealed over expensive wine and reputations were measured in silence rather than words. On this particular evening, every table was occupied by people who believed they had already won. At the center of the room sat Richard Hale, dressed in a tailored black suit with a crisp white shirt and a black tie pulled perfectly into place. Richard carried himself with the ease of a man who had just closed a massive deal. His posture was relaxed, his movements precise, practiced from years of being watched. Across from him sat Natalie Quinn, her wine-red dress hugging her frame, her black heels tucked neatly beneath the table as she scrolled through her phone without pause. Natalie laughed loudly at something on her screen and angled it toward Richard, pointing out designer bags and private villas she wanted to see next. Her voice carried easily through the space, confident and unrestrained. Richard lifted his glass of expensive red wine and took a slow sip, the taste familiar, almost dull. The celebration around him felt rehearsed, like a performance he had played too many times. Around them, conversations drifted between stock prices, real estate acquisitions, and political influence. The room hummed with ambition. Natalie leaned back in her chair and grinned, boasting about friends who envied her lifestyle and the man sitting across from her. Richard nodded absently, his gaze drifting past her shoulder, scanning the room as if searching for something he could not name. Then the atmosphere shifted. The change did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, subtly, like a breath being held. Voices lowered first, then stopped altogether. Forks paused mid-air. Chairs ceased their movement. Richard noticed the stillness before he understood it, his instincts sharpening as the hum of the restaurant faded into an uneasy hush. Staff members straightened where they stood. The restaurant manager, moments earlier relaxed and smiling, moved quickly toward the main entrance. A group of men in black suits appeared near the doorway, their steps measured, their movements disciplined and silent. Richard lifted his head, curiosity flickering across his face. At first, he saw only the doorway and the light spilling in from outside. Then, a woman stepped forward. Grace Miller entered the restaurant with calm, deliberate steps. A light cream coat rested on her shoulders, open just enough to reveal a floor-length emerald green evening gown beneath. The fabric flowed softly as she walked, tailored with care and intention. Beneath the dress, the unmistakable curve of a 7-month pregnancy was visible, carried with quiet dignity. Richard's breath caught. Grace did not rush. She did not hesitate. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, her presence undeniable. At her side walked Jonathan Cross, tall and steady in a charcoal suit that spoke of wealth without spectacle. His hand rested naturally on Grace's arm, guiding her forward with ease and familiarity. The chandeliers above caught the light as they moved, reflecting off the sapphire necklace at Grace's throat. The stones glimmered sharply, drawing the eye, marking her as someone no longer meant to fade into the background. Richard's grip tightened around his wine glass. He recognized her instantly. Grace was his former wife. Natalie followed Richard's line of sight and turned, her smile faltering as she took in the scene. Her brows knit together, irritation flashing across her face as she watched the attention shift away from their table. She glanced back at Richard, confused by the sudden change in his expression. Grace's pregnancy was impossible to ignore. Richard's heart pounded violently as the realization settled in. His chest tightened, his thoughts scattering as he tried to process what stood in front of him. The woman he had once dismissed as no longer fitting into his future now stood at the center of the room, radiant, unflinching, and undeniably changed. Jonathan Cross walked beside her with effortless authority. He did not rush. He did not scan the room. He moved as if the space already belonged to him. As Grace and Jonathan passed between tables, eyes followed them in silence. Conversations did not resume. No one whispered. The moment demanded attention without asking for it. Richard felt his throat go dry. Grace did not look away. She did not lower her gaze or pretend not to see him. As she passed Richard's table, her eyes briefly met his. There was no anger in them, no sorrow, no accusation, only distance, the kind of distance that made it clear she was no longer part of his world. Natalie shifted in her seat, discomfort evident as she watched the exchange. She leaned toward Richard, ready to ask a question, but he did not hear her. His attention remained fixed on Grace as she continued forward, her hand still resting lightly against Jonathan's arm. The crystal chandeliers overhead reflected sharply against the sapphires at her neck, making her stand out against the muted luxury of the room. Grace did not glance back again. She did not need to. Richard swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His celebration had vanished without a word spoken. What moments earlier had felt like triumph now felt hollow, exposed. The silence lingered. And in that silence, Richard understood that the dinner he believed marked another victory had become the beginning of something he could no longer control. Jonathan Cross walked into the restaurant at an unhurried pace, yet every gaze in the room turned toward him without hesitation. It was not curiosity that drew the attention, but recognition. His presence carried weight that did not need announcement, the kind that settled into a room and reshaped it instantly. The charcoal suit he wore was understated, free of ornament or excess, but it reflected the quiet authority of long-established wealth. This was not the fashion of someone chasing relevance. It was the uniform of someone who had never needed to prove it. As Jonathan moved forward, several influential diners inclined their heads slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture of respect that required no words. From his seat, Richard Hale felt the shift immediately. He recognized Jonathan not from headlines or interviews, but from balance sheets and boardroom briefings. Jonathan Cross controlled multiple investment funds tied directly to the financial stability of Richard's company. That realization struck with uncomfortable clarity. The power Richard believed he commanded suddenly felt conditional, fragile, dependent. A faint unease crept into his chest. Jonathan's hand rested lightly against Grace's back as they walked, a natural and protective gesture that spoke of familiarity rather than performance. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any confrontation could have. Richard's mind betrayed him, pulling him backward into memories he had long dismissed. He remembered Grace standing in their first cramped apartment, waiting for him to come home late from work, believing in him without question. He remembered how that patience had once felt ordinary, even expected. Now it felt distant. Natalie Quinn shifted in her chair, her discomfort growing as she realized she was no longer the focal point of the evening. Her laughter faded. Her posture stiffened. She glanced around, searching for attention that no longer came naturally. Richard barely noticed. He watched how the restaurant staff reacted as Jonathan approached. Chairs were drawn back with care. Menus were offered with both hands. Service slowed and sharpened at the same time, deliberate and precise. This was not flattery. It was protocol. Grace walked beside Jonathan at a measured pace, mindful of her steps, one hand instinctively adjusting the fall of her emerald gown as she protected the life she carried. There was nothing fragile about her movement, only caution rooted in purpose. No one whispered as they passed. No one laughed. The room remained suspended in a respectful quiet that pressed against Richard's ears. He tightened his grip around his wineglass, the pressure whitening his knuckles until the stem felt like it might crack. His pulse thudded loudly, out of rhythm with the calm unfolding before him. Natalie leaned closer, her voice lowered, asking who they were. Richard did not answer. He did not trust his voice to remain steady if he tried. Jonathan was guided to a private table positioned for the best view in the restaurant, a place that required no reservation because it was always kept available. Grace was helped into her chair with careful attention, Jonathan's hand steady, his focus entirely on her comfort. Richard watched, unsettled by the realization forming in his mind. He had never offered Grace that kind of consideration when she was his wife. The thought landed heavily. A cold clarity followed. He saw now how casually he had stepped over moments that mattered, how easily he had assumed her patience would never run out. Jonathan did not speak loudly. He did not claim the room, yet everything seemed to arrange itself around him regardless. Natalie shifted again, clearly uneasy with the unfamiliar seriousness of the atmosphere. The room no longer felt playful or indulgent. It felt controlled, measured, adult. Richard stopped hearing Natalie altogether. His attention narrowed until only one thought remained, pulsing insistently in his mind. The curve of Grace's pregnancy lingered in his vision, undeniable and precise. The timeline began forming against his will, each calculation tightening the knot in his chest. He stared at the glass in his hand, the dark red wine reflecting the chandelier light above, and realized that his confidence had quietly drained away. In its place sat a single, unanswered question, and the silence around him offered no relief. Grace sat beside Jonathan Cross with her back straight, both hands resting lightly on her thighs. Her posture was calm and grounded, the kind that came not from effort, but from certainty. She did not scan the room or shift in her seat. She simply existed within it, present and composed. The restaurant's soft lighting settled gently across her face, revealing a quiet strength that had not been there years ago. It was not beauty sharpened for attention, but something steadier, maturity shaped by experience and survival. The tension that once clung to her shoulders was gone. From across the room, Richard watched. He noticed it immediately. Grace looked healthier, stronger, and more radiant than she ever had during their marriage. There was a fullness to her expression that unsettled him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because he realized it had never belonged to him. Whatever had worn her down in the past was no longer visible. The exhaustion he remembered, the silence, the careful steps, the way she used to wait, had disappeared. Natalie's gaze traveled openly over Grace, from the emerald gown to the subtle curve of her pregnancy, lingering with an edge of appraisal and envy. There was no attempt to hide it. Natalie had always believed confidence meant being seen. Grace did not look back. It was as if Natalie occupied no space in her awareness at all. That absence struck Richard harder than any confrontation could have. He felt a sharp flicker of memory. Grace standing in front of a mirror years earlier, wearing a simple dress, asking if it was appropriate for a formal dinner. He remembered the impatience in his own voice, the casual dismissal, the suggestion that she should keep it simple. He remembered telling her to stand slightly behind him at events. Those memories returned uninvited, stacking one atop another, each one heavier than the last. The woman sitting across the room now bore no resemblance to the person he had once underestimated. Grace's confidence did not announce itself. It did not seek validation. It simply was, and that certainty made Richard feel unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. Grace turned her head slightly toward Jonathan and spoke to him in a low voice. Whatever she said prompted a small, gentle smile from her, brief, unguarded, sincere. It was not a smile meant for display. It rose naturally, rooted in comfort rather than performance. Richard recognized that immediately. That smile was not offered to win approval. It came from a place of safety. The realization tightened something in his chest. Grace no longer needed anyone's permission to exist fully. She no longer required his acknowledgement to feel complete. Richard felt the weight of that truth settle in. Grace did not glance toward him again. Her attention remained with Jonathan, her body language open, relaxed, anchored in the present. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sign of restraint born from uncertainty. The curve of her pregnancy remained unmistakable, a quiet but undeniable marker of the life she now carried. It reminded Richard, with brutal clarity, that Grace had crossed into a chapter of life entirely separate from him. Natalie leaned closer to Richard and murmured something sharp under her breath. A comment meant to diminish, meant to provoke. Her tone was light, dismissive, calculated to sting without drawing attention. Grace did not respond. She continued her conversation with Jonathan, her expression unchanged. The contrast was striking. Natalie's words hovered briefly in the air before dissolving into nothing. Grace's silence rendered them irrelevant. Richard felt something unfamiliar, a sense of displacement. He was no longer part of Grace's environment. He was not an obstacle. He was not a presence she needed to manage. He was outside. For the first time in many years, Richard did not know where he belonged in the room. The role he had always assumed, the center, the axis, no longer applied. Grace's world had reorganized itself without him, and it showed in every detail. Her calm made one thing unmistakably clear. The past had been closed, not with anger, not with regret, but with acceptance. Richard understood then that he no longer had access to her life in any meaningful way. Whatever connection he once believed he could reclaim had already slipped beyond reach. Grace had moved forward without looking back, and the door behind her had been shut with quiet finality. The realization left him still. The restaurant's sounds slowly returned at the edges of his awareness, but he did not move. He did not speak. He remained seated, suspended in a moment where nothing more could be said. And in that heavy silence, Richard accepted that the woman he once called his wife no longer existed in his future at all. Richard watched Grace from across the room, and without warning, the present loosened its grip on him. The restaurant faded into the background as old images pushed their way to the surface, sharp and uninvited. He had not planned to remember. The memories came anyway. He saw Grace, as she had been in the beginning, standing beside him in their first small apartment, wearing a simple dress that did not quite match the seriousness in her eyes. The place had been cramped, the furniture mismatched, but she had smiled as if it were enough. At the time, Richard had believed it was only temporary, a phase before success arrived. Back then, Grace stayed awake longer than he did. While Richard slept, she reviewed documents, corrected numbers, and reorganized proposals he would present the next morning. She never asked for credit. She never complained. Her support had been quiet, constant, and easily overlooked. Richard had promised her a full life once he made it. He had said it with confidence, certain that success would justify every sacrifice they were making. Grace had believed him. She had built her patience around that promise. When the money finally started coming in, something shifted. The conversations changed. Richard listened less. His attention moved elsewhere, toward meetings, appearances, and people who reflected the version of himself he wanted to become. Grace noticed, but she said little. She suggested starting a family more than once, raising the idea carefully, as if afraid it might break something fragile between them. Richard always found a reason to delay. There was another deal, another expansion, another excuse that sounded reasonable in the moment. Over time, Richard began to see Grace differently. He told himself she no longer fit the rooms he now occupied. Her simplicity, once comforting, began to feel inconvenient. At formal events, he asked her to stand slightly behind him. At first, it was subtle. Later, it became routine. Comments followed. Remarks about how she dressed. Observations about how she spoke. Suggestions framed as advice, but delivered as judgment. Grace absorbed them quietly, hoping restraint would preserve what remained of their marriage. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. He did not see the effort behind it, the decision to endure rather than confront. He believed her compliance confirmed his assumptions. When he came home late, Grace waited. When he did not come home at all, she waited anyway. Then Natalie appeared. With her presence came admiration, excitement, and the intoxicating feeling of being desired without expectation. Richard felt younger, sharper, more visible. He told himself it was harmless at first, then necessary, then justified. Without realizing it, he began measuring Grace against Natalie in his own mind. Grace could not compete with someone who asked nothing of him. Evenings that once ended with conversation became long stretches of silence. Grace waited for Richard, night after night, until waiting turned into sleeping alone. Richard barely noticed the change. He assumed her patience was endless. He believed her sacrifices were natural. Eventually, the marriage felt like an obligation rather than a partnership. Richard resented the weight of it, convinced that he had outgrown something that once held him steady. When he decided to end it, he felt certain he was doing the right thing. The day he signed the divorce papers, Richard experienced relief. He saw the decision as clean, efficient, necessary. Grace accepted the documents without argument. She did not cry. She did not plead. She did not ask him to reconsider. Her composure reinforced his belief that the separation was mutual. What Richard did not know was that Grace carried a secret that day. One she did not share because the space to share it no longer existed. He did not see the hesitation behind her calm, or the restraint it took to walk away without revealing what she had just learned. The memory tightened around him now. Richard's chest felt heavy as the realization settled fully. He had not lost a marriage all at once. He had dismantled it piece by piece, mistaking endurance for permission and silence for absence of pain. The past did not accuse him. It did not shout. It simply stood there, undeniable. And as the memory released him back into the present, Richard understood something he had avoided for years. He had not walked away with less than he expected. He had walked away with far more than he realized. Richard fell silent and began counting. Not out loud, not deliberately. The numbers assembled themselves in his mind with a precision he could not stop. Weeks, months, dates layered over one another until a single conclusion forced its way forward. His pulse quickened as the math refused to bend. The realization landed with a physical impact. Grace had been pregnant before she left the marriage. His heart began to race, a sharp, irregular rhythm that cut through the quiet of the room. Fear rose first, then anger, tangled together so tightly he could not separate them. He felt exposed, as if something private had been dragged into the open without warning. Richard pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough to draw Natalie's attention. She looked up at him, startled, her brows knitting as she tried to read his face. "What's going on?" she asked. Richard did not answer. He stepped away from the table, his focus locked on Grace, his jaw tight, his breathing uneven. The distance between them suddenly felt unbearable. He took a few tense steps toward her table, his posture rigid, his intent obvious to anyone watching. Marcus Boyd moved immediately. The security chief stepped into Richard's path with a single decisive motion, his stance firm and unyielding. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch Richard. He did not need to. The message was clear. Richard stopped short, frustration flashing across his face. "I need to speak to her," Richard said, his voice tight and urgent. Privately, Jonathan Cross lifted his head. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at Richard. The room seemed to narrow around that glance. Jonathan did not display anger. He did not show hostility. His expression remained composed, his eyes steady and assessing. The effect was immediate. Richard faltered, the momentum of his approach breaking under the weight of Jonathan's gaze. He felt suddenly outmatched, not physically, but in a way that cut deeper. The authority Jonathan carried required no explanation. Grace raised her head then. She met Richard's eyes calmly, without hesitation or fear. Her expression held no trace of panic, no flicker of regret. She did not shift in her chair or glance toward Jonathan for reassurance. She faced Richard on her own terms. Richard spoke before he could stop himself. He asked about the child. The question hung in the air, unmistakable and public. Heads turned. Conversations ceased entirely. The room seemed to hold its breath, as Richard waited for an answer he was no longer certain he deserved. Grace answered, without raising her voice. She said she had discovered the pregnancy shortly before she was asked to leave the house. Her words were steady, measured, unembellished. She explained that she had tried to speak that day. She had wanted to tell him, but the moment never came. Richard had not allowed space for conversation, let alone confession. The door had closed before she could say a word. Natalie's posture shifted. Confusion crept into her expression as she listened, her earlier confidence draining away. She glanced between Richard and Grace, trying to reconcile the narrative unfolding in front of her with the version of events she believed she knew. Richard felt his throat tighten. The truth pressed against him from all sides. The timing, the silence, the realization that his certainty had been built on incomplete information. He struggled to breathe evenly, the weight of it all compressing his chest. Natalie began to fidget, her discomfort obvious now. The tension in the air no longer felt abstract or distant. It had settled directly between the four of them, heavy and inescapable. Richard swallowed hard. He spoke again, this time invoking responsibility, obligation, rights. He reached for words that had always served him well, terms that implied authority and control. He framed himself as a man prepared to step forward, to claim what he believed was his. The words sounded hollow even as he said them. Jonathan placed his hand flat against the table. The simple gesture was enough. It cut through Richard's speech, signaling a clear end to the exchange. Jonathan did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He asserted a boundary, and the room respected it. Silence followed. It spread outward, filling the space left behind by Richard's unfinished claims. No one spoke. No one moved. The air felt thick, difficult to draw into the lungs. Richard stood where he was, the certainty he once relied on slipping further out of reach. Natalie remained beside the table, her unease now fully visible. Grace sat still, composed, her hands steady. The truth had been spoken, and nothing in the room felt the same afterward. Richard spoke again, this time with a firmness that bordered on desperation. He said he had a right to know about the child Grace was carrying, a right rooted in biology and history. The words sounded practiced, as if he had used them before in rooms where authority usually bent in his favor. Grace listened without interrupting. She did not rush to respond, nor did she turn away. Her face remained calm, her breathing even, as though she were weighing not his claim but the meaning behind it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and precise. She said that fatherhood did not come from declarations, but from actions. The sentence landed quietly, without emphasis, yet it shifted the weight of the room. Grace reminded him of the nights she had driven herself to the hospital, hands tight on the steering wheel, fear contained because there had been no one else to share it with. She spoke of the long corridors, the cold chairs, the hours spent waiting alone. She described the prenatal appointments Richard had not attended. She did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated facts that required no interpretation. Each one stripped away another layer of Richard's certainty. He searched for a response, for a counter-argument, but none came. The room offered him no shelter. Jonathan reached for Grace's hand. The gesture was simple, unforced, and unmistakably supportive. He did not look at Richard as he did it. His attention remained with Grace, as though the rest of the room had receded beyond relevance. The contact spoke more clearly than words ever could. Grace continued. She said Jonathan had been the first person to ask if she was tired. The first to notice when her steps slowed. The first to suggest rest without making it feel like weakness. Jonathan had arranged the doctor's appointments, coordinated schedules, and ensured she was never alone when decisions had to be made. He had been present at every ultrasound. Grace said he listened not just to medical explanations, but to her fears. He asked questions. He waited for answers. He did not rush the process or treat it like an inconvenience. In his presence, the pregnancy had felt safe. She said she wanted the child to grow up in peace, not fear. The words lingered in the air, unchallenged. Richard felt something shift inside him. The comparison formed on its own, sharp and unavoidable. He saw the difference between being involved and being entitled, between proximity and presence. He recognized it, even as it unsettled him. Natalie exhaled sharply, her impatience becoming visible. She shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with how long the exchange had lasted. Her expression hardened, irritation creeping in as the conversation moved beyond her control. The seriousness of it no longer entertained her. Richard, sensing his ground slipping, reached for his final argument. He spoke of blood. He invoked lineage as if it were a shield, something ancient and undeniable that could reclaim what he felt was being taken from him. The word hung between them, heavy with expectation. Grace did not react. She answered calmly, saying that love was what held a family together, not shared DNA, not claims made too late. Love, she said, was the choice to stay when it mattered, not the insistence to appear when it was convenient. Jonathan spoke then. His voice was quiet, measured, and deliberate. He said he was prepared to protect Grace and the child by every legal means available. There was no threat in his tone, no bravado. He stated it as a fact, firm and resolved. The room seemed to contract around that statement. Jonathan did not raise his volume, yet his words carried clearly through the silence. The authority behind them was unmistakable. It did not demand agreement. It assumed it. Richard felt as though he had stepped into a space where his usual leverage did not apply. The walls he faced were not physical, but they were impenetrable all the same. He stood still, absorbing the reality that had formed in front of him. For the first time, he understood that he was no longer the central figure in Grace's life. That realization struck deeper than the earlier revelations. It was not humiliation that settled over him, but displacement. The sense that the role he once occupied had been reassigned, not out of malice, but necessity. Grace did not look at him with triumph. She did not seek closure from his reaction. She simply sat there, her hand still in Jonathan's, her posture composed, her boundaries clear. The conversation had reached its natural end without resolution or reconciliation. Silence followed. It was dense and unyielding, wrapping itself around all three of them. No one spoke. No one moved. The restaurant remained suspended in that moment, as if waiting for something that would not come. And in that silence, Richard understood that the question he had asked no longer belonged to him. The first visible change comes from Natalie Quinn. At the beginning of the moment, she still sits upright in her chair, chin slightly raised, fingers resting near her wineglass, as if control remains within reach. Yet her eyes betray her before her posture does. Richard is no longer looking at her. His attention, once fixed and automatic, now drifts again and again toward the other table. Natalie notices the absence immediately. The realization tightens her jaw, and impatience flickers across her expression like a crack in polished glass. She shifts her body toward Grace's table, leaning just enough to invade the space without standing. Her gaze sweeps over Grace from shoulder to hem, slow and deliberate, carrying a mixture of envy and quiet contempt. Natalie's lips curve into a thin smile that never reaches her eyes. "So," she says lightly, her voice carefully projected to carry, "emerald green now? Bold choice?" End. The comment lands in the air, sharp but coated in silk. Grace does not turn. She remains seated with her back straight, shoulders relaxed, her posture composed beside Jonathan Cross. Her hands rest calmly, and her attention stays forward, as though Natalie's voice never reached her ears. The dismissal is absolute, not defensive, not reactive. It is absence. That silence unsettles Natalie far more than any response could have. Richard watches the exchange from his seat, his chest tightening as something unfamiliar surfaces. Natalie's tone, once playful to him, now sounds strained. The ease he once admired feels brittle. He glances at her face and, for the first time, notices the effort behind her expression, the need to provoke, to be seen. Natalie press on. She tilts her head slightly, voice sweetened with mock sympathy. "I remember when Grace preferred simpler things," she adds, letting the past slip into the present. "People change, don't they?" A few heads nearby shift. The room has noticed. Jonathan remains silent, but his eyes lift. The look is not aggressive. It is steady, assessing, and final. The kind of gaze that does not challenge, but ends conversations before they begin. Natalie's words falter for half a second as she registers it, her confidence wobbling under its weight. Grace finally moves, but not toward Natalie. She lifts one hand and rests it gently against her belly, a small, instinctive gesture of protection. The movement is slow, natural, and deeply grounding. It reframes the moment without a single word. The presence of her pregnancy becomes undeniable, not as spectacle, but as reality. Richard's memory responds before he can stop it. He recalls Natalie's constant demands for attention, her impatience when his focus drifted, the way every silence had once been treated as an offense. The contrast sharpens painfully. Across the room, Grace offers no performance, no plea. Her calm is not calculated. It simply exists. He looks back at Natalie and, for the first time, sees her clearly. The smile she forces now appears fragile. Her confidence depends on reaction, on resistance, on control. When none comes, she falters. She laughs softly, an awkward sound that fades too quickly, searching Richard's face for affirmation. It does not arrive. A subtle shift ripples through the restaurant. Conversations slow. Glances begin to move, not toward Grace, but toward Natalie. The evaluation is quiet, unspoken, but unmistakable. Natalie feels it and stiffens, her shoulders drawing tighter as the room no longer aligns with her. Richard's embarrassment surfaces suddenly, hot and unmistakable. He recognizes it as his own. Natalie's behavior exposes not only her insecurity, but his judgment. Each sharp word she offers feels like a mirror turned back on him. She reaches for his hand. Her fingers brush his skin, tentative, seeking reassurance. Richard does not pull away, but he does not respond. The space between their hands becomes heavy, charged with what is missing. Grace remains composed. She does not glance over. She does not react. Her calm steadies the air around her, refusing to bend to provocation. The balance of the room shifts further, away from Natalie's noise and toward Grace's quiet authority. Jonathan places his hand on the table, the gesture measured and deliberate. It is not a threat, it is a statement of presence. His posture remains unchanged, but the implication is clear. This is not a space Natalie controls. Richard sees it all at once. Natalie's breathing quickens. Her posture tightens. The confidence she tried to wield collapses under the weight of scrutiny. She cannot hold the room the way Grace does, not without forcing it. not without fracturing herself in the attempt. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Grace embodies restraint without effort. Natalie reveals tension with every word. In that moment, Richard understands something he has avoided for too long. He did not choose excitement over stability. He chose insecurity over strength. He mistook noise for presence, insistence for passion. The realization lands heavily, final and irreversible. The restaurant grows quieter. No one speaks. No one moves. And in that silence, Richard sits frozen between the woman he once dismissed and the woman he now sees for who she truly is, fully aware that the choice he made has already condemned him. A woman in a black blazer steps into the restaurant without hesitation. Her stride is steady, deliberate, and unhurried, cutting cleanly through the ambient hum of conversation and clinking glassware. She does not scan the room out of uncertainty, but out of confirmation, as if she already knows exactly where she is going. The polished floor reflects the sharp line of her shoes as she advances. Evelyn Hart carries a dark leather portfolio tucked firmly under her arm. The folder is worn at the edges, not from carelessness, but from use. It signals routine, experience, and authority rather than spectacle. Her expression is neutral, professional, and composed, the kind that does not seek permission or acknowledgement. She walks straight toward Richard's table. There is no pause, no detour, no glance toward Natalie. Her focus remains fixed, and when she reaches the table, she stops precisely at the distance required to command attention without invading space. The movement alone shifts the balance of the room. Richard looks up. In the instant their eyes meet, something cold settles into his chest. He understands immediately that this is not coincidence, not confrontation, not drama. The presence standing before him carries intent. Control slips from his grasp before he has time to resist it. Evelyn introduces herself briefly. Her name is spoken once, clearly, without flourish. She sets the leather portfolio down on the table between the wine glasses and the folded napkins, aligning it neatly as though placement itself matters. The sound it makes is soft, yet unmistakable. Natalie's eyes drop to the folder. She frowns, confusion knitting her brow as she tries to assess the object's significance. The unease creeps in slowly, unwelcome and unfamiliar. She shifts in her chair, sensing a shift she cannot influence. Evelyn opens the portfolio and speaks again. Her tone remains calm as she informs Richard that he has just been served with a civil lawsuit. The words are precise, measured, stripped of emotion. There is no accusation in her voice, only fact. The meaning lands heavily. The lawsuit concerns overlooked marital rights and unmet financial obligations. Each phrase is delivered cleanly, without emphasis, as though the gravity of the content requires no embellishment. The weight exists on its own. Richard reaches for the documents. His hand trembles despite his effort to steady it. The first page lifts reluctantly, the paper crisp and official. His eyes move across the text, but comprehension lags behind recognition. The language is formal, exacting, and unmistakably binding. There is no room for debate. Every clause is structured with clarity. Every line anticipates resistance and closes it off before it can form. The document does not threaten. It defines. Grace remains silent. She does not lean forward. She does not react. She does not speak. She does not participate in the exchange unfolding at Richard's table. Her absence from the legal conversation is intentional and absolute. Jonathan watches from a short distance away. His posture is relaxed, his demeanor calm. There is no tension in his face, no triumph, no satisfaction. He observes with the quiet assurance of someone who prepared long before this moment arrived. Around them, a few diners begin to notice. Forks pause mid-air. Conversations thin. Curiosity ripples outward, subtle but undeniable. Something unusual is happening, and the room senses it. Natalie shifts back in her chair. The seriousness of the situation reaches her at last. The playful barbs she offered moments ago evaporate, replaced by a sharp awareness that she is no longer standing on solid ground. She retreats by inches, instinctively distancing herself from the epicenter of consequence. Evelyn continues, unhurried. She emphasizes that this filing represents only the initial step in a broader legal process. Her words are neither threatening nor dramatic. They are procedural, inevitable. Richard's breathing grows heavier. The realization presses inward. This is not a scene engineered for humiliation or revenge. There are no raised voices, no spectacle, no performance. Grace did not come to create chaos. She came with preparation. Every action she has taken operates within the boundaries of the law, clean and unassailable. The restraint itself becomes the sharpest blade. Jonathan rises. Without a word, he steps closer to Grace and pulls out her chair with quiet respect. The gesture is simple, intimate, and unforced. It does not draw attention, yet it speaks volumes. Richard notices. The moment cuts deeper than the documents in his hands. It underscores what he has lost, not through attack, but through contrast. Evelyn closes the portfolio. The sound echoes softly, final. She offers no further commentary. There is nothing more to add. The legal process has been set in motion, and its presence lingers like a held breath. Silence settles over the table. No one speaks. No one moves. The restaurant resumes its low murmur gradually, but the space around Richard remains suspended, heavy with implication. The legal strike required no raised voice, no confrontation, no drama, only precision, only silence. Grace rises first. The movement is unhurried, deliberate, and immediately felt across the room. Chairs do not scrape, voices do not lift. The restaurant seems to sense the shift and yields to it, falling into a respectful hush as Jonathan Cross stands beside her. Jonathan offers his arm, not as a gesture meant to be seen, but as one meant to be steady. Grace accepts it naturally, her posture composed, her expression calm. Together, they turn away from the table without a backward glance. Marcus Boyd steps in behind them. He keeps the appropriate distance, neither too close nor too far, his presence quiet but unmistakable. His eyes scan the room briefly before settling forward again, focused on the exit rather than the people left behind. As Grace walks, the overhead lights catch the emerald fabric of her dress. The color glows softly under the crystal fixtures, reflecting movement rather than drawing attention. The effect is subtle yet undeniable, a final visual imprint that lingers longer than words ever could. Richard remains seated. The space Grace leaves behind feels suddenly vast. The chair across from him is empty, yet the absence presses against his chest as if something physical has been removed. A hollow sensation spreads through him, slow and invasive, draining the strength from his shoulders. Natalie watches Grace go. Her eyes follow every step, every quiet gesture, her expression caught between anger and panic. The confidence she once clung to dissolves as she realizes that nothing she says now can alter what is unfolding. She turns toward Richard, opening her mouth to speak. No words come. Richard does not look at her. He stares down at the documents laid neatly on the table, the civil filing now occupying the space where wine and small talk once sat. The paper seems heavier than before, as though its meaning has deepened in Grace's absence. Natalie tries again. She begins to talk about leaving, about how uncomfortable the atmosphere has become, about how people are watching. Her voice fades into the background, muffled and distant, as though spoken from another room. Richard hears nothing. His gaze fixes on the printed text before him. The legal language no longer feels abstract. Each line presses inward, not as accusation, but as confirmation. This is real. This is happening. This cannot be undone. He lifts his eyes briefly. Across the room, he catches the final image of Grace and Jonathan nearing the exit, moving in quiet alignment. There is no tension between them, no urgency, only certainty. The memory strikes him without warning. Grace leaving years ago, standing at the door with the same calm expression, carrying nothing but resolve. He remembers assuming she would return. That silence meant pause, rather than conclusion. Now, he understands the difference. This time, she is not leaving in uncertainty. She is leaving complete. The realization settles heavily. Richard exhales slowly, his chest tightening, as he recognizes that this moment will not repeat itself. There will be no call, no reconciliation, no reopening of doors he once closed without thought. Money still exists. The numbers, the assets, the influence he built remain intact, at least for now. Yet, they feel strangely irrelevant in the wake of what has just occurred. The security he trusted no longer offers comfort. The future he imagined no longer includes what mattered most. The child Grace carries is not part of the legacy he once envisioned, not because of distance or conflict, but because he has been removed from that future entirely. The truth lands quietly, devastating in its simplicity. Richard finally understands the nature of punishment. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives through exclusion. The greatest consequence is not the lawsuit, nor the scrutiny that may follow. It is the certainty that Grace's life will continue without him, whole and protected, while he remains behind. The restaurant begins to recover. Conversations restart in low murmurs. Glasses clink softly. The hum of normalcy returns, cautious at first, then steady. To everyone else, the evening resumes. For Richard, nothing does. He sits alone at the table, surrounded by polished surfaces and ambient light, yet profoundly isolated. Natalie remains beside him, but the connection feels severed, irrelevant, incapable of bridging the space that has opened within him. The emptiness settles fully. There is no confrontation left to face, no words left to say, no action left to take. Only understanding, only silence. And in that silence, Richard Hale becomes fully aware that he has not merely lost a moment, a marriage, or a family, but the life he believed he was entitled to keep. Richard Hale stays seated as the restaurant slowly returns to its normal rhythm. The hush that had hovered over the room begins to thin, replaced by the cautious return of conversation and movement. Servers resume their routes. Chairs shift. A couple at a nearby table leans in to speak again, their voices low at first, then gradually more natural as the moment passes. Richard does not move. The tailored black suit that once made him feel untouchable now feels like a weight he cannot shrug off. The fabric presses against his shoulders in a way it never has before, as if it has absorbed the truth of the last hour and refuses to let him forget it. He sits with his back straight out of habit, but the posture no longer reads as control. It reads as rigidity, as something held together by force. Natalie Quinn stands beside him. Her face is tight with frustration, a quiet fury that expects attention, expects reassurance, expects Richard to fix the discomfort the way he always used to. She waits for him to react, to speak, to give her something that confirms they are still the center of the room. Nothing comes. Richard's eyes drift toward the direction Grace Miller left with Jonathan Cross. The exit is no longer visible from where he sits, but the image remains clear in his mind, sharper than the printed pages of the lawsuit resting on the table. He sees Jonathan's arm offered to Grace without hesitation. He sees how Jonathan naturally placed himself between her and the crowd, not as a statement, not as performance, but as instinct. The gesture was so simple, it felt inevitable. And that is what makes it brutal. Richard recognizes, with a clarity that stings, that he never did that when Grace was his wife. Not once. He had walked ahead, assuming she would follow. He had allowed rooms to swallow her while he took the spotlight. He had treated her presence as background rather than partnership, and he had mistaken her silence for acceptance. Around him, the soft clink of silverware against porcelain grows more noticeable. Forks tap plates, knives scrape lightly through steak. The sound is ordinary, harmless, and yet it amplifies Richard's isolation. Each small noise highlights what he cannot ignore: the fact that life continues easily for everyone else, while something in him has collapsed. Natalie exhales sharply. "This is ridiculous," she says, her voice edged with annoyance. "The whole night got ruined. We should leave." Richard does not answer. His gaze drops to the wineglass in front of him. The red wine inside has cooled, untouched. A thin ring of condensation clings near the base. The glass reflects the chandelier light above, but the reflection feels distant, like something belonging to another evening. He stares at it as if it might offer a way back. Instead, it pulls him further inward. He remembers the early days, before the power, before the dinners meant to be seen. Grace had believed in him then, with a kind of trust that feels impossible to imagine now. She had looked at him as if his potential was something sacred. She had defended him when others doubted. She had stayed up late, corrected his mistakes, smoothed the rough edges of his ambition, without asking to be recognized for it. Richard understands now what he traded away. He traded sincerity for image. He traded quiet loyalty for applause. He traded a life built on respect for a life built on appearances, and he convinced himself it was success. Money did not protect him from this moment. It cannot buy back the family he dismantled. It cannot purchase the respect he assumed was permanent. It cannot restore the version of himself Grace once trusted. Richard feels the truth settle deeper. There is no investment large enough to compensate for what he has lost. No fund, no portfolio, no acquisition can replace the simple things he dismissed when they were offered freely. Natalie shifts her weight, impatient. She waits again for Richard to respond, but he remains silent, his attention fixed on the glass, on the space, on the reality he can no longer avoid. Her frustration hardens into something colder. With a final, irritated breath, Natalie turns away. She steps back from the table and begins to walk off, already preparing to leave the restaurant. She does not look over her shoulder. She does not check if he follows. Her exit is brisk, practical, and unromantic, as if she is stepping away from an inconvenience rather than a relationship. Richard watches her go without moving. In that moment, he recognizes something else with unsettling ease. Whatever bond he and Natalie had was never built on devotion. It existed while it served them, while it flattered them, while it made Richard feel admired and untouchable. Now, with the illusion cracked, the connection evaporates. He sits alone. He stays there for several minutes, not because he has something left to do, but because he cannot bring himself to stand yet. The muscles in his legs feel distant. The room feels too bright. The air feels too thin. And then, quietly, without ceremony, a new understanding takes shape. For the first time, Richard accepts that his failure is not limited to marriage. It is larger than that. It is the failure of character, the failure to protect what mattered, the failure to be a man worthy of the loyalty he received. He had believed his role in Grace's life was guaranteed. He believed he could return whenever he wished, that the past would remain accessible simply because he wanted it. Now he knows better. Grace is gone, carrying a life he no longer has any claim to touch. Not because she is punishing him, but because she has moved forward. The separation is complete, final, and clean. Richard lowers his head. He feels the cost of his choices, the way a person feels winter settle into their bones. Slow, unavoidable, lasting. The restaurant continues around him, elegant and indifferent. The waiters keep working. The diners keep eating. The city outside keeps moving. The story ends without a final argument, without a dramatic confrontation. It ends with silence. And in that silence, Richard Hale understands that some things, once lost, cannot be bought back for the rest of a lifetime.